Ava Collins had always believed that fate was nothing more than a word people used to justify their bad decisions. She clutched the small white box of prescription pills tighter as she hurried through the gleaming marble corridors of Roland Medical Center, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes. Evidence of another sleepless night spent calculating bills that never seemed to shrink. At 24, she had already mastered the art of becoming invisible at a place like Roland Medical. Where designer handbags cost more than her monthly rent, invisibility was survival. She was just another face in scrubs. Another temporary contract worker whose name would be forgotten before her badge expired. The pills rattled in their container as she quickened her pace. Mrs. Henderson in room 412 needed them before midnight, and Ava still had 3 more patients to check on before her shift ended. The elderly woman reminded her painfully of her own grandmother, Ruth, who waited at home in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, counting every labored breath. Ava turned the corner near the executive wing, an area she typically avoided. The very air felt different here, heavier with the weight of money and power. She glanced at her watch and cursed silently. If she cut through the administrative corridor, she could save precious minutes. The heavy oak door appeared without warning. One moment she was rushing forward, focused on reaching her patient. The next, she collided with something solid and unyielding. The pill bottle flew from her hands, scattering white capsules across the pristine marble like scattered stars against a dark sky. Ava's palm pressed flat against expensive fabric, fingers accidentally gripping what felt like a muscled chest beneath perfectly tailored wool. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, she felt the warmth of another human being. The steady rhythm of a heartbeat that seemed to sync with her own panicked pulse. Then she looked up. Ethan Roland stood above her, his steel-gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. At 32, he commanded Roland Medical with the same ruthless precision his father had once wielded, though whispers in the hallways suggested he lacked his father's warmth. Not that anyone had ever accused the elder Roland of being particularly warm. His black suit was immaculate except for the slight wrinkle where her fingers had gripped the fabric. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the collision. But it was his eyes that held her captive, cold and calculating as they studied her face, as if memorizing every detail. "Did you think touching me would get you somewhere, Miss Collins?" His voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of absolute authority. Ava's stomach dropped. He knew her name. Of course he did. This was his hospital, his kingdom. And she was nothing more than a temporary subject who had just committed an unforgivable transgression. "I'm sorry, sir. It was an accident." Her voice cracked, despite her efforts to remain steady. She dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered pills with trembling hands. Each capsule felt like a lifeline she was desperately trying to reclaim. Ethan stepped closer, his shadow falling across her like a prediction of doom. No? The few nurses at the far end of the corridor had frozen in place, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Everyone who worked at Roland Medical knew the stories about Ethan Roland's temper, though few had witnessed it firsthand. "I want touch." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the sterile air like a blade. "You think you can climb that high with a single touch?" Ava's fingers slipped on the smooth marble as she reached for the last few pills. "Please, sir. My patient needs these medications." "I swear it was an accident." For a moment, something flickered across Ethan's face. It was gone so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it, but for that brief instant, expression had seemed almost ... curious. He crouched down beside her, his expensive cologne mixing with the antiseptic hospital smell. Without speaking, he picked up one of the fallen pills and placed it carefully in her open palm. His fingers brushed against hers for just a second, but the contact sent an unexpected jolt of electricity up her arm. "You will pay, Miss Collins," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear, "in ways you cannot even imagine." Then he stood and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with military precision. The nurses quickly returned to their work, pretending they had seen nothing, but Ava remained on her knees for several more seconds. Staring at the pill in her palm where his skin had touched hers, she finally forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. The white box felt heavier now as she clutched it against her chest, as if it contained more than just medication. It held the weight of a promise she didn't understand, a debt she hadn't knowingly incurred. As she walked toward Mrs. Henderson's room, Ava tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. She was still invisible, still temporary, still just another face in scrubs. But deep in her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs with the persistent rhythm of a truth. She wasn't ready to acknowledge something had shifted in that moment of contact, something that made her skin tingle and her thoughts scatter like pills across cold marble. She had touched Ethan Roland, and somehow, impossibly, he had touched her back. 3 days passed before Ava understood the true weight of Ethan Roland's words. She arrived at the hospital Thursday evening to find her access card had been deactivated. The turnstiles that had welcomed her for the past 6 months now beeped, with mechanical rejection trapping her in the lobby while security guards watched with barely concealed satisfaction. There must be some mistake, Ava told the receptionist, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. I have patients to check on. Mrs. Henderson, in 412, is expecting her evening medications. The woman behind the marble desk didn't even look up from her computer screen. Miss Collins, your contract has been terminated, effective immediately. Please return your badge and any hospital property. The words hit Ava like a physical blow. She fumbled for her badge, her hands shaking. As she unclipped it from her scrubs, 6 months of work. 6 months of proving herself reliable and competent, erased with the casual efficiency of a mouse click. Can I at least speak to my supervisor? There has to be some explanation. Mr. Roland doesn't provide explanations for staffing decisions. The receptionist's tone carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Security will escort you out if necessary. Ava stood in the marble lobby for several minutes, watching nurses and doctors flow around her like water around a stone. Many of the faces, people she had worked alongside, saved lives with, shared coffee with during brutal double shifts. They looked through her as if she had already faded from existence. The subway ride back to Brooklyn felt endless. Each station that passed took her further from the hope of steady income, from the insurance that kept her grandmother's medications affordable. By the time she reached her stop, tears she hadn't realized she was crying had dried into salt tracks. On her cheeks, Ruth was waiting in their tiny apartment, wrapped in the faded blue blanket that had belonged to Ava's mother. Her grandmother's eyes, once bright with intelligence and humor, now seemed clouded with pain and concern. How was work, sweetheart? Ruth asked, though her voice carried the careful tone of someone who already suspected bad news. It was fine. Grandma, just fine. The lie tasted bitter on Ava's tongue, but she couldn't bear to add her grandmother's worry to the weight she already carried. Did you take your evening pills? I'm saving them, Ruth said quietly. The bottle's getting empty, and I know how expensive they are. Ava knelt beside her grandmother's chair, taking the frail hands in her own. Don't you worry about that. I'll figure something out. I always do. But lying awake that night, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere, Ava couldn't see any path forward. Her savings would last perhaps 2 weeks. The job market for contract nurses was brutal, and without a reference from Roland Medical, her resume would sink to the bottom of every pile. She had almost drifted into uneasy sleep when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss Collins. My office. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Come alone. Ava stared at the screen until the words blurred. Ethan Roland. Somehow, impossibly, the CEO of Roland Medical had her personal phone number and was summoning her like a feudal lord calling a peasant to court. She should delete the message, should block the number, and pretend she had never seen it. Should pack what little they owned and leave New York City before whatever game Ethan Roland was playing could destroy what remained of her life. Instead, she texted back a single word, yes. The next evening, Ava stood outside the Roland Medical building in the only dress she owned, a simple black number she had worn to her parents' funeral years earlier. The security guard who had watched her be escorted out just 24 hours ago now checked her name against a list and waved her toward the executive elevators without a word. The ride to the top floor felt like ascending to judgment. When the doors opened, she found herself in an opulent reception area that seemed designed to intimidate. Original paintings lined the walls, and the carpet beneath her feet was so thick it felt like walking on clouds. Miss Collins. A woman. In an immaculate suit, apparetto materialized from the air itself. Mr. Roland is waiting for you. The walk down the hallway felt endless. Each step brought her closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, to a confrontation she couldn't possibly win. The woman knocked once on a set of double doors, then pushed them open without waiting for a response. Ethan Roland's office was a study in controlled power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, making the city look like a collection of toys arranged for his pleasure. The man himself stood silhouetted against the glittering skyline, his back to the door. "Thank you, Margaret. That will be all." His voice carried across the room without him turning around. The woman retreated, closing the doors with a soft click that sounded like a trap snapping shut. Ava remained near the entrance, unsure whether to advance or flee. "You came," Ethan said, finally turning to face her. He had removed his suit jacket, and his white shirt was open at the collar, making him look somehow more dangerous than he had in full corporate armor. "I wasn't certain you would." "You destroyed my life," Ava said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The least you could do is explain why." Something that might have been respect flickered across his features. "Direct, I appreciate that quality." He moved toward his desk, gesturing for her to take one of the leather chairs positioned in front of it. "Please sit. I prefer to stand. Suit yourself." Ethan settled into his own chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me about your grandmother." The question caught her off guard. "What does my grandmother have to do with anything? Humor me." Ava's jaw tightened, but she found herself answering despite her better judgment. "She raised me after my parents died. She's everything to me. She's sick, and her medications are expensive, and without my job, I can't afford to keep her alive." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" Among other things. Ethan opened a folder on his desk, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. Ruth Collins, age 78, diagnosed with congestive heart failure and diabetes. Currently receiving care from Dr. Martinez at Brooklyn General, attending medical bills totaling approximately $47,000. The blood drained from Ava's face. "How do you know all that?" "I make it my business to know everything about people who interest me," Ethan said, closing the folder. "And you, Miss Collins, have become unexpectedly interesting. Because I bumped into you. Because I accidentally touched your precious suit. Because you touched me," he said quietly. "And I felt it." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Ava stared at him, trying to decipher the meaning behind his carefully controlled expression. "I don't understand." Ethan stood and moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "I haven't felt human touch in over 3 years. Miss Collins, not by choice. It's a medical condition that my family prefers to keep private. Yet somehow, when you collided with me, when your hand pressed against my chest, I felt everything." Ava's mind reeled. "That's impossible, so I thought." He turned back to her, his eyes intense with something that looked almost like hunger. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to understand what happened, what made you different. I've had blood work done, consulted with specialists, reviewed security footage, frame by frame. The conclusion I've reached is both simple and impossible, which is, you, Miss Ava Collins from Brooklyn, are the only person in 3 years who has been able to touch me and make me feel human again." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "And I'm prepared to offer you a deal that will solve both of our problems." "A deal?" Ava's voice barely rose above a whisper. Ethan moved to his desk and withdrew a thick document from the top drawer. The papers rustled softly as he placed them in front of the empty chair, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy silence of his office. "A contract," he said simply. 1 year of your life in exchange for everything your grandmother needs and more." Ava stepped closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The document's cover page bore the Roland medical letterhead and what appeared to be her full name typed in precise legal formatting. What kind of contract? Sit down, Miss Collins, please. This time she didn't refuse. The leather chair enveloped her as she reached for the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she began to read. The legal language was dense and complicated, but certain phrases leaped out at her like warning flares. Exclusive personal assistant to CEO Ethan Roland. Available 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Compensation, including full medical coverage for designated family members. Housing provided in Roland Estate guest quarters. Confidentiality agreement with severe penalty clauses. She looked up to find Ethan watching her with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. Personal assistant. This sounds like something else entirely. Read section 7. Ava flipped through the pages until she found the relevant section. Her eyes widened as she absorbed the words. Physical therapy and wellness coordination? What does that even mean? It means exactly what you think it means, Ethan's voice carried. No embarrassment, only clinical precision. My condition isn't just medical, Miss Collins. It's neurological. For 3 years, human touch has felt like electricity, painful and overwhelming. Doctors have tried everything from medication to experimental treatments. Nothing has worked. He moved around the desk to stand beside her chair, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body. Until you crashed into me in that hallway. For the first time in 3 years, Touch felt he paused, searching for the right word. Normal, human, real. Ava's heart hammered against her ribs. You want me to be some kind of therapy? I want you to help me remember what it feels like to be human, Ethan said quietly. In return, your grandmother will receive the best medical care available. Her bills will be paid in full. You'll live in a wing of my estate with your own apartment and complete privacy when not needed. The salary alone is more than you'd make in 5 years of nursing. She flipped to the compensation page and nearly dropped the contract. The figure typed there contained more zeros than she had ever seen outside of lottery commercials. This is insane, she breathed. Is it? Your grandmother needs constant medical attention. You need financial security. He trailed off, his jaw tightening with some internal struggle. I need to remember who I was before this condition turned me into something cold and untouchable. Ava stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the city lights twinkled below like fallen stars. You're talking about paying me to touch you. How is that different from prostitution? Ethan's voice held no judgment, only tired resignation. Because I'm not asking for sex, Miss Collins. I'm asking for basic human contact. A hand on my shoulder. Sitting close enough to share body heat. The kind of casual intimacy that normal people take for granted. She spun to face him, searching his expression for any sign of deception. What she found instead was something that looked remarkably like vulnerability, carefully hidden behind layers of control and power. Why me? Surely you could find someone more suitable, someone from your world. A bitter smile crossed his lips. My world is populated by people who want something from me. Money, power, social connections. They touch me because they have to. Because it's expected. Every contact feels calculated, manipulative. But when you crashed into me, when your hand pressed against my chest, there was no agenda. It was pure accident, pure human clumsiness. And for the first time in 3 years, touch didn't hurt. Ava sank back into the chair, her mind spinning. What exactly would you expect from me? Ethan returned to his side of the desk, his movements precise and controlled. Nothing you're not comfortable giving. We would start slowly. Hand contact, sitting in proximity, perhaps eventually progressing to more casual intimacy as my nervous system readjusts. The goal isn't physical gratification, Miss Collins. It's therapeutic rehabilitation. And if it doesn't work, if whatever happened in that hallway was just a fluke, then you'll have honored a year-long contract that will set you and your grandmother up for life. The risk is minimal on your end. Ava looked down at the contract again, her eyes catching on a clause near the bottom of the page. Absolute discretion required regarding the nature of employment and any personal information about Ethan Roland or the Roland family. Violations subject to immediate termination and legal action for damages not to exceed $5 million. Blood chilled. $5 million in damages. The Roland family has enemies, Miss Collins. Industrial competitors. Disgruntled former employees. Journalists looking for scandal. If word got out about my condition, about this arrangement, it would destroy not just me, but the thousands of people who depend on Roland Medical for their livelihoods. The weight of what he was asking began to sink in. This wasn't just a job, or even an unusual therapy arrangement. This was stepping into a world where information was currency and mistakes could destroy lives. I need time to think. You have until tomorrow night, Ethan said, his tone returning to its earlier businesslike efficiency. If you decide to accept, sign the contract and return it to Margaret. If not, delete my number and forget this conversation ever happened. Ava stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. And my grandmother's medical bills will be transferred too. Roland Medical's charity care program regardless of your decision, Ethan said quietly. Consider it compensation for the inconvenience I've caused you. She stared at him, searching for the catch, the hidden trap that would explain such unexpected generosity. Why would you do that? For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing something raw and almost desperate beneath. Because 3 years ago, I lost the ability to connect with another human being. For 30 seconds in a hospital hallway, you gave it back to me. That's worth more than any amount of money. Ava clutched the contract to her chest as she headed for the door. Her hand was on the handle when his voice stopped her. Miss Collins? Whatever you decide, thank you for showing me it was possible. She didn't trust herself to respond. Instead, she fled his office, rode the elevator down to street level, and walked into the New York night with a contract that could change everything or destroy what little she had left. The subway ride back to Brooklyn passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and rattling metal. By the time she reached her apartment, Ruth was asleep in her chair, the television playing softly in the background. Ava covered her grandmother with the faded blue blanket and sat at their tiny kitchen table, reading the contract by the light of a single bulb. 24 hours to decide whether to step into Ethan Roland's world of wealth and secrets. To become the human touch that could heal a broken man. 20-4 hours to choose between safety and the unknown. Between poverty and a golden cage. Between the life she knew and the life she could never have imagined. The contract lay open before her, waiting for a signature that would seal both their fates. Ava signed the contract at 3:47 a.m., sitting in the pale glow of her phone's flashlight, while her grandmother slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The Roland estate car arrived the next evening as promised, a sleek black sedan that looked obscenely expensive, parked outside their crumbling Brooklyn apartment building. The driver, a polite man named Thomas, helped load Ava's few belongings and wheeled Ruth's portable oxygen tank to the car with the efficiency of someone accustomed to discretion. "Where are we going, sweetheart?" Ruth asked as the sedan pulled. Away from the only home Ava had known for the past 6 years. "Somewhere better, Grandma. Somewhere you can get well." The Roland estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured grounds in the Hamptons, hidden behind wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees. The main house loomed like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering spires that seemed to scrape the evening sky. Ava's new home was a converted guest cottage that could have housed 3 families comfortably, complete with a medical suite for Ruth that would have been the envy of most hospitals. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived within hours of their settling in, a warm woman in her 50s who specialized in geriatric cardiology. She examined Ruth with gentle thoroughness, while Ava hovered nearby, still unable to believe this was real. "She's stable, but will need to adjust her medication regimen," Dr. Chen told Ava privately afterward. "With proper care and the right environment, she could have several good years ahead of her." "Several years?" Ava's voice caught. The doctors in Brooklyn had spoken in terms of months at best. The stress of financial worry, inadequate housing, and poor nutrition were accelerating her decline, Dr. Chen explained. Remove those factors, provide proper medical support, and the human body has remarkable resilience. That first week passed. In a surreal haze, Ava spent her days helping Ruth adjust to their new surroundings and her evenings in the main house, sitting with Ethan in his study while he worked. Their interactions were careful, formal, limited to brief moments of contact that felt more like medical procedures than human intimacy. A hand placed gently on his shoulder while he reviewed documents. Sitting close enough on the leather sofa that their knees occasionally brushed. Small touches that seemed to ground him in ways that medication never had. "You're very good at this," he told her one evening after she had spent 20 minutes with her palm resting against his forearm while he made phone calls. "Most people want to rush the process, push for more contact than I can handle. Most people haven't spent years caring for someone fragile," Ava replied, adjusting the cashmere throw that always lay across his lap during their sessions. "Healing takes patience." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. "Is that what you think this is? Healing? Isn't it?" Before he could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway with the kind of urgency that suggested crisis. "Mr. Roland, your Uncle Gregory is here to see you. He says it's urgent family business." Tension that instantly seized Ethan's body was unmistakable. His hand, which had been relaxed under Ava's touch, clenched into a fist. "Tell him I'm in a meeting, sir. He's brought Charlotte with him. And several board members." Ava didn't understand the full significance of the names, but she recognized the look of a cornered animal in Ethan's eyes. "Should I go?" "No." Voice carried absolute command. "Stay exactly where you are." The next few minutes brought the sound of multiple voices in the foyer, followed by footsteps approaching the study. Gregory Roland entered without knocking. A man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him came a stunning blonde woman who could have stepped from the pages of a fashion magazine, and 3 men in expensive suits who radiated corporate authority. "Ethan," Gregory said with false warmth, his gaze immediately fixing on Ava's hand, still resting on his nephew's arm. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." "You are, actually." Ethan's voice could have frozen water. "This is a private medical session." "Medical." Charlotte's laugh was like breaking glass. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The board members exchanged meaningful glances, and Ava realized with growing horror that this was no coincidental visit. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated and perfectly timed. "Gentlemen," Gregory addressed the board members while keeping his eyes on Ava. "I think you can see for yourselves that the rumors about my nephew's condition have been greatly exaggerated. In fact, it appears he's made a remarkable recovery." "Rumors?" Ava asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Gregory's smile turned predatory. "The rumors that Ethan suffers from a neurological condition that makes him incapable of normal human relationships. That he's physically unable to fulfill the most basic requirements of marriage and fatherhood. Rumors that have made the board question his ability to secure the Roland family legacy." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The hasty contract, the generous compensation, the absolute secrecy requirements. Ava wasn't just therapy for Ethan's condition. She was proof that he could be touched, could be intimate, could potentially produce the heir that his family demanded. "You used me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ava, it's not what you think." Ethan started to stand, but she jerked her hand away from his arm as if burned. "Isn't it?" Charlotte stepped forward, her perfect smile sharp with malice. "Did you really think a man like Ethan Roland would pay you hundreds of thousands of dollars just to hold his hand? You're not a therapist, sweetheart. You're a very expensive prop." The room spun around Ava as the full magnitude of her stupidity crashed over her. The contract she had signed so gratefully, the miracle cure for her grandmother's illness, the fairy tale rescue from poverty, it was all built on deception. She was nothing more than a hired actress in Ethan's performance of normalcy. The board meeting is next week, Gregory continued conversationally. Father's will is quite clear. The Roland medical empire passes to the family member most capable of continuing the bloodline. Ethan's little medical problem made that impossible, but apparently he's found a creative solution. Get out. Ethan's voice cut through the room like a blade. All of you, get out now. We'll leave you to your therapy, Gregory said with a mocking bow. But remember, nephew, the board expects a full demonstration of your recovered capabilities. Soon, a wedding announcement perhaps. Pregnancy rumors. The kind of proof that investors find reassuring. They filed out as smoothly as they had entered, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the wreckage of whatever fragile trust had been building between Ava and Ethan. Let me explain, Ethan said the moment they were alone. Explain. What? That you've been lying to me from the beginning? That my grandmother and I are just pawns in some corporate power struggle? Ava backed toward the door, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. That contract I signed, it wasn't about helping you heal. It was about helping you fake normalcy long enough to fool your board of directors. That's not true. My condition is real, Ava. What happened between us in that hallway? What happens every time you touch me? It's all real. But not the reason you hired me. She reached the doorway and paused, looking back at the man who had saved her grandmother's life and simultaneously destroyed her faith in human decency. Tell me honestly, Ethan, if I hadn't been able to touch you, if that first contact hadn't worked the way it did, would you have paid my grandmother's medical bills anyway? Would you have offered me any of this? His silence was answer enough. Year isn't up yet, he said finally. The contract is still binding. Sue me for the $5 million then, Ava said. Add it to all the other debts I'll never be able to pay. At least I'll know I earned this one honestly. She left him sitting alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of power that had never been able to buy him the one thing he truly needed: genuine human connection. As she walked back to the cottage where her grandmother slept peacefully in a bed that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier, Ava wondered if it was possible to be saved and destroyed by the same person. The answer, she suspected, was written in invisible ink in the contract she had signed in the desperate darkness of 3:47 a.m. Ava spent 3 days avoiding the main house, caring for Ruth and planning an escape that seemed impossible. The contract she had signed was ironclad, the penalties for breaking it astronomical. Every time she considered calling a lawyer, she remembered the $5 million damage clause and the reality that she owned nothing worth that amount except her grandmother's life. On the 4th morning, she found Ethan sitting on the cottage's front porch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and looking like he hadn't slept in days. Your security system told you I hadn't left the grounds, she said, not really a question. I was hoping you'd come to the main house, when you didn't. He gestured vaguely at the porch swing where he sat, his usual controlled composure notably absent. I needed to tell you something. Something I should have told you from the beginning. More lies. The truth. He looked up at her with eyes that held a weariness she had never seen before. The whole truth, not just the parts that served my purposes. Despite every instinct screaming at her to walk away, Ava sat down on the opposite end of the swing. I'm listening. Ethan was quiet for so long, she wondered if he had changed his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. My father didn't die of natural causes, he said. He was murdered by someone he trusted, someone who had been systematically poisoning him for months, with a compound that mimicked the symptoms of heart disease. It's the same compound that was later found in my bloodstream during routine testing after I became CEO. Ava's breath caught. Someone tried to poison you too? Someone succeeded in poisoning me. The neurological condition, the inability to tolerate human touch, sensitivity to physical contact that felt like electrical burns, it wasn't natural. It was induced. Deliberately. The swing creaked softly as a breeze stirred the morning air. Ava found herself leaning forward despite her resolve to remain detached. Who? Someone with access to my food, my drinks, my personal space. Someone who could dose me regularly over a period of months. Someone who stood to gain enormous power if I was deemed unfit to run the company or continue the family line. His jaw tightened. Someone who probably expected the poison to kill me, not just make me untouchable. Gregory. I couldn't prove it, as the compound breaks down quickly in the human body, and by the time we identified what was happening, it was nearly undetectable. But the neurological damage was already done. 3 years of trying every treatment imaginable and nothing worked until you. Ava stared at him, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. That's why you needed the contract. Not just to prove you could be touched, but to stay alive long enough to expose whoever was poisoning you. Gregory's been pushing for a board vote to declare me mentally incompetent due to my condition. Once that happened, he would become acting CEO, and accidents have a way of happening to inconvenient family members. Ethan's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who had learned not to trust anyone. I needed time to heal, to gather evidence, to figure out how he was administering the poison, and I was your human canary in the coal mine? You were my lifeline, he said quietly. Whatever you did, however your touch worked, it began reversing the neurological damage almost immediately. For the first time in 3 years, I could think clearly, could feel normally, could remember what it was like to be human instead of a walking shell. Ava absorbed this revelation, her anger warring with something that felt dangerously like sympathy. Why didn't you tell me? Why the elaborate charade about therapy? Because I didn't know if it would work, because I didn't know if you could be trusted. Because 3 years of paranoia doesn't disappear overnight, even with miraculous healing. He turned to face her fully, his eyes holding a vulnerability she had never seen before. And because I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd run. And without you, I'd go back to being untouchable, and Gregory would win everything. So you lied to protect yourself. Right, I lied to protect both of us, and your grandmother. Do you think Gregory would hesitate to hurt an old woman, if it served his purposes? No. Do you think he wouldn't use her as leverage to control you, to control me? The cottage door opened behind them, and Ruth appeared in her wheelchair, wrapped in the soft pink robe that had been waiting in her room when they arrived. Her color was better than Ava had seen it in months, her breathing steady and unlabored. "Good morning, dear," Ruth said to Ethan, with the gentle courtesy that had never left her despite years of hardship. "You look terrible. Have you been sleeping?" "Not recently, Mrs. Collins." "Ruth, please." She wheeled closer to the swing, her keen eyes moving between Ava and Ethan. "Now, what's this argument about?" "I may be old, but I'm not deaf, and I've heard raised voices for the past 10 minutes. Ava started to deflect, to protect her grandmother from the complicated web of corporate intrigue and family betrayal, but Ruth held up a frail hand. "Child, I raised you to tell the truth even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." So Ava told her everything, the contract, the deception, the poison, the corporate power struggle that had somehow ensnared them all. Ruth listened, without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. She said, when Ava finished, "That's quite a story. Ethan, dear, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you love my granddaughter?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Ethan's carefully constructed walls crumbled visibly as he struggled with an answer that clearly terrified him more than any corporate takeover ever could. "I don't know how to love anyone," he said finally. 3 years of isolation taught me how to survive, how to protect myself, how to trust no one. I don't know if what I feel for Ava is love or just desperate gratitude for giving me back my humanity. That's honest, at least." Ruth's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had loved deeply and lost much. "Ava, sweetheart, what about you? Underneath all this anger and hurt, what do you feel for this foolish man?" Ava's throat tightened. "I don't know, Grandma. I thought I was helping someone heal. I thought what we were building was real. Now I don't know what was genuine and what was just part of his survival strategy." "Then let me tell you what I see," Ruth said, reaching out to take both of their hands in her own surprisingly strong grip. "See two people who found each other in the darkness and brought each other back to the light. I see a man who has forgotten how to trust, but trusted you enough to let you touch him. I see a granddaughter who has spent her whole life caring for others and finally found someone who wants to care for her in return, even if he doesn't know how to say it." She squeezed their hands gently. "The how and why of how you got here doesn't matter as much as what you choose to do now. Ethan, if you want a real chance with Ava, you need to stop protecting yourself and start protecting her. Put her safety above your own survival, your truth above your secrets. And Ava," Ruth continued, "if you want a real chance with him, you need to decide whether you can forgive a man for being human, for making mistakes born of fear rather than malice. Can you love someone who is still learning how to love himself? The morning stretched between them, filled with the possibility of truth and the terror of vulnerability. Finally, Ethan spoke. There's a board meeting tomorrow. Gregory expects me to announce my engagement to Charlotte, to provide proof that I've recovered sufficiently to secure the family legacy. If I don't, he looked directly at Ava. If I don't, he'll have grounds to declare me incompetent. And within 6 months, you and Ruth will be back in Brooklyn, and I'll be dead. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to marry me, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. Shh. Not for the board, not for the contract, not to save my company. Marry me because somewhere between that first accidental touch and this moment, you became the only real thing in my life. Marry me because I want to spend whatever time I have left learning how to love you properly. Ava stared at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and corporate armor to the man underneath. A man who had been poisoned, isolated, and nearly destroyed, but who had somehow found the courage to ask for the one thing he needed most: genuine connection with another human being. This is insane, she whispered. Completely, Ruth agreed cheerfully. The best love stories usually are. Ava closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. When she opened them again, she found Ethan watching her with an expression of hope so fragile it could shatter with a single word. Ask me again, she said. Not as part of a corporate strategy or a survival plan. Ask me because you mean it. Ethan slid off the swing and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his own. For the first time since she had known him, his touch was warm, human, real. Ava Collins, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a man who is still learning how to be human? Will you help me remember what it means to love someone more than you love yourself? She looked down at him, this powerful man brought to his knees by something as simple and complex as love, and realized that somewhere along the way, her heart had made the decision her mind was still struggling with. Yes, she said, and felt the word transform everything around them. Yes, I'll marry you. But not because of contracts or corporate politics or family legacies. I'll marry you because when you touch me, I remember who I am when I'm not afraid. Clapped her hands together with delight. Well, that's settled then. Now, shall we plan a wedding, or do we have a corporate coup to stop first? Ethan laughed, the sound rich and genuine, and completely human. Both, I think. Definitely both. 6 months later, Ava stood in the sunlit garden of the Roland estate, wearing a simple white dress that had belonged to Ethan's grandmother and holding a bouquet of wildflowers Ruth had insisted on picking herself that morning. The small gathering included only people who mattered: Dr. Chen, who had become Ruth's closest friend, Margaret, whose loyalty had proven absolute, Thomas, who had quietly gathered evidence that led to Gregory's arrest, and a handful of others who had earned their place through genuine affection rather than social obligation. Gregory was serving a 25-year sentence for murder and attempted murder. Charlotte had married a pharmaceutical executive whose family name carried almost as much weight as Roland's, though considerably less actual power. The board had unanimously confirmed Ethan's leadership after his miraculous recovery, and the stunning revelation of the attempted corporate takeover. But none of that mattered as much as the moment when Ethan took Ava's hands in his own and promised to love her with the same courage she had shown in loving him. Their kiss was warm, human, real, and tasted like the future they would build together. Later, as the evening settled over the estate and the last guest departed, Ava found herself alone with her husband in the garden where they had been married. Ruth was inside, regaling Dr. Chen with stories of Ava's childhood, her laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Any regrets? Ethan asked, pulling her close against the growing chill. Ava considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she had been a struggling nurse with an impossible contract and a dying grandmother. Now she was married to one of the most powerful men in New York, living in a fairy tale that sometimes still felt too good to be true. Only one, she said finally. Ethan tensed slightly. Which is, I regret that it took a collision in a hospital hallway for us to find each other. I regret all the years we could have had if we'd met differently." "I don't," Ethan said, his arms tightening around her. "If we'd met any other way, I would have been too arrogant to see you, too damaged to deserve you, too afraid to reach for you. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected accidents." Ava smiled, remembering the scattered pills and the moment of contact that had changed everything. "In that case, I'm very glad I'm such a clumsy person." "So am I," Ethan whispered against her hair. "So am I." They stood together in the garden as the first stars appeared overhead. Two people who had learned that healing was possible, that love could triumph over fear, that sometimes the most beautiful futures grew from the most devastating mistakes in the cottage nearby. Ruth Collins fell asleep in her comfortable bed, surrounded by photographs of the granddaughter who had saved her and the man who had learned to love them both. Her breathing was steady and peaceful, and her dreams were filled with weddings and grandchildren and the knowledge that love, like hope, could bloom in the most unlikely places. The end asterisk, like this video, if the story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love, and let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.